My name is Charles Amartey. Um, I'm from Ghana. I'm from West Africa, Ghana, and I had my bachelor's in the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology back in Ghana. Um, I majored in painting and sculpture, and I was also part of this community back in Ghana called Black Star Lines. And we in Black Star Lines we had this initiative like um, every term or every semester where we go to town for 2 weeks and draw inspiration from town. So we went for one of these 2 week trips, 2 week inspirational trips, and I saw this building that had moss growing like in the crevices of it, and I was pretty interested in how like these mosses grew. Uh, they grew spontaneously. They didn't need like any human hand or human agency to grow, and they grew out of natural occurrences and everything. And it made the building look. The building was old, so, but it made the building look really beautiful. So I was interested in that aspect of uh, the uncontrollable nature of the moss on the building, and I was thinking of ways I could bring that uncontrollability or spontan that spontaneous nature to the studio and make art from it. So it started off by me scraping off pieces or samples of the moss, so different species of moss from the same building, and cultivating that sample in my studio. And it started off then. I tried making paintings from like different colors of moss, since there are different species and they grow differently and they grow with different colors. So I was interested in how the color I could create like an abstract painting from like these colors. So fast forward, I wanna summarize the story. Fast forward, I moved to working with bacteria, sweat bacteria, and the particular bacteria in mention is Bacillus cereus, which is normally found in the sweat glands. So I was interested in incorporating that bacteria in sculpture pieces. So charging sculpture pieces with human bodily fluids as a way to connect specific DNAs of like particular people in my project. And it was also a way to draw a cultural connection between the land and also the people. Fast forward, I was moving on to a larger organism and trying to draw inspiration from like these little organisms. So in my previous project I spoke about, the moss, I gave the moss moisture and everything to grow, and I noticed there was a worm like in the moss. And I figured, oh, I've created the perfect ecosystem for the worm to like come in and like live in. So I took a photo just like any artist would do. I took a photo of the worm, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna work on this project next. So I came to Victoria, BC, and started my project. I'm currently in my second year grad school, UVic, Department of Visual Arts. I started my experiments with earthworms, and then progressed to different species of worms, observations of worms, how I started asking questions like how I could change the color to make art pieces, how they could naturally change their color by eating certain foods. Um, Also questions of what ifs, like, oh, where do these creatures, these microorganisms go when they die? Do they go to heaven? Do they have their own heaven? Do they have their own hell? Like, so I kept on asking myself these questions, and these questions like just more like visions to me, and I just imagine like these spaces where the worms are in these uh, uh, personified spaces of human ideologies, of religion, and I create these spaces in my mind and make paintings out of them. So we have these paintings here where I put in different species of worms and like connects them to that personified idea or that personified space. I also have the worm heaven there, where it's a whole paradise there. And so I was also working on another species, and these species were known as the European night crawlers. So I was like, okay, the word night crawlers, they're a bit darker. So the night crawlers, I wanted to make them dark in there. So it's just, because they're just slightly darker than the red wigglers, which is a different species of worms over there. So I wanted to differentiate the species, so I made the European night crawlers in the painting dark, totally dark, to represent their species, and the red wigglers there are reddish brown in there. So I was also experimenting with materials like grout to give this texture-like effects to the earthworms or different species of earthworms I was working with. In this painting, that's when I started like connecting like to the two different species of earthworms in one compost bin, and I was interested in like the meetup of the worms, like a different species meeting another species, but they're of the same they're the same organism. So how is that going to look like? Are they gonna eat each other alive? Are they gonna work together? Are they gonna just live together and all of that? So these were questions I kept on asking myself. So in most of my paintings, you see the dark tones I applied to the worm paintings. Those are the European night crawlers I was experimenting with, and also the red wigglers over there. So just goes across, where I also make like live paintings. I make paintings, like detailed paintings, which are also my observations. Just like in any science lab where they have observations like photographs and everything, I make paintings, I observe them and make these interesting paintings, I would say, and to represent these species, these organisms. I also have photographs. Now these photographs were taken by an SEM machine in UVIC's microscopy section, and they were zoomed in. And so I was exploring the idea of color too, and how I could change the color of the worm to make a painting. As I said earlier in my previous projects, like all about thinking out of the box to make something new, something like out of this world. So it started with this paintings where I changed the color using post-production methods, Photoshop. I had the close-up shots, took it to Photoshop, changed the colors, added a little bit of burn. I used the burn tool to merge the highlights together to get this interesting color. This photograph, it was one of my experiments with a dead worm I found in the compost. So basically, worms like compost each other. If there's a dead worm in there, they're gonna like compost it, like they're gonna eat it up, and then the cycle just keeps on going round and round. So it's a whole cycle of life going in the compost bin. I took the dead earthworm in the compost and put it in a different type of compost system. So this compost system is an anaerobic compost system, and this compost system doesn't require oxygen. It has the jar of the compost has to be sealed tight, and it uses this agent called bokashi. And so bokashi is like bran. It's bokashi's bran is more like dried bread or carbohydrates and it has a little bit of bacteria in them, and it speeds up the compost process. So exposing the worm into like the bokashi or the anaerobic compost was interesting because it changed it changed the structure of the worm totally, adding like color, adding like new shapes I haven't seen before, and also like even these whitish substances around it. And it was a really interesting discovery for me because in a way it's a sculpture piece made by nature, and so appreciating it in the show was something I was like really keen to doing. Uh, yeah, I was also interested in like the yellow colors there over there, which is not something common for like you wouldn't see a yellow worm around here anywhere. So also adding like spontaneous colors too was interesting for me. Uh, yeah, these. I'm now experimenting with the color too. I started with the sculpture pieces, started experimenting with fluorescent powder, and so as I said earlier, from the compost bin, the dead worms, they're in here. So I was interested in freezing the state of time, and I thought to myself, like, how would I like freeze time? Like, what material would be like suitable for freezing time? So I was like, okay, let's try candle wax. I started experimenting with candle wax and also experimenting with sensory organ, like the sensory aspect of candle wax. Like, either I could go scented, unscented, and also relating to the sensory organs of the worms too, because they're very sensitive. So I wanted to play around that sensory nature in the show where the audience would like pass by the work and like smell something, like like it actually smells good, but the worms too are very sensitive. They're really sensitive organisms. So they don't have noses or they don't have like any features that help them smell or like help them see. So I wanted to play around that whole sensory ideology where even here when it's dark, it's kind of hard to see a bit because it's black light and our eyes are not used to it. So I was playing around the whole idea with that. We also have a video. So the video too is also my observations, the observations I made. Now in there, the sound was a really interesting sound I attached. So it's interesting because when I first showed this film or the movie, the audiences were asking if it was the actual sounds earthworms make, and earthworms don't make sound; they're silent creatures. So it's interesting to get feedback from this and like to play with the perception, play around the idea of like science fiction, and also reality, there, and my observation like in the experiments is like to connect like some personifications, like some personified ideas between humans and also like the earthworms, where in the video you see the earthworm meets another earthworm, that earthworm from the experiment over there, and the earthworm has gone through a change. It has gone through a drastic change and it's unrecognizable, so I mean, any organism who meets a similar or the same organism, it's gonna recognize, no matter how, like, if it can't see or feel, it knows this is my organism. You're from my colony, or you're from my place. We're connected. But the shape and everything of the worm changed, but interestingly, the worm, I felt like I saw the worm like move towards it and poke towards it like closely. And it was interesting to me because there are many derivatives, or anyone could derive anything from that viewing or that sight. But from my perspective, I saw the worm grieve, and I felt the worm was sad and was grieving its fellow worm, and I thought it was really interesting to document. And so this whole like sound is the sound of the worm, the supposed worm grieving of its dead one, and it's interesting to connect that whole ideology between humans and worms. So basically, my practice as an artist is to find ways to draw inspiration from these microorganisms or these creatures, and connect ourselves as humans in any aspect of life to these microorganisms in any way possible. So basically, that's what I do as an artist, and yeah, thank you.